So the word I would like to insist on is process. We should never forget that Amoris Laetitia is the fruit of a synodal process. But not only that, I was present in October 2015, and one day Pope Francis said there will be a meeting, and that was the announcement of the synodal pathway. So really, the Synod on the Family is the starting point of the synodal process. Is a bit like the interpretation of the Second Vatican Council we had during the last Synod, 2024. A friend of mine, unfortunately, he died very soon after, Felix Wilfred. He gave a wonderful conference saying, in India, in Asia in general, we don't analyze the Vatican Council as a text. We rather try to see what Vatican II has made possible. And I think the same time for Amoris Laetitia. So, of course, you have contents, but you should never separate Amoris Laetitia from this process of synodality. Amoris Laetitia was the result of, but also the beginning of. So that's what I wanted to say here. And of course, a pastoral process, we know, always have some impact on doctrine. I know it is a very controversial theme, but I would like to quote Magnifica Humanitas, the first encyclical by Pope Leo. I was glad to be at the presentation with him last Monday in Rome. And he says in number 25, the truth of the gospel is not imposed from above, but grows over time within the concrete interweaving of lives, communities, and cultures. Magnifica Humanitas 25. So we see that not only with Pope Francis, but this, and you have many expressions in Magnifica Humanitas on synodality and the relationship between the common good and synodality. But the central point, and this is very important for what Amoris Laetitia changed in the Catholic approach to marriage and the family, is processuality. So it's processuality in the church, in the reception of the truth of God, the truth of marriage, of course, but it is also receiving the processuality of marriage. So it has to do with the historical dimension of marriage. So the process is still going on. You've seen that on the 19th of March, Pope Leo invited all the presence of bishops' conferences in Rome for October, second week of October, to deepen, he says, Amoris Laetitia offers valuable teachings that we must continue to deepen today. Approfondire in Italiano. The English text says to examine today, which is not the same. That's the problem. And I will mention so many problems of translation that change a lot. The problem is that the people who work at the Vatican to translate, they could lack some competence, but also loyalty to the Holy Father. Okay, pastoral changes lead to doctrinal change. I refer to the well-known book 2005 of Noonan, A Church That Can and Cannot Change, the Development of Catholic Moral Theology. So it's true that, take an example from the Second Vatican Council. You have in the Constitution on the liturgy, you have the insistence of active participation of the faithful in the liturgy. This is a pastoral change, and it had consequences with the language of the liturgy, but it has also many doctrinal impacts. Take the insistence on all the synods on baptism. You know, so saying, okay, should all Christians, all baptized should participate more in the liturgy. That's a pastoral change, but insisting on baptism as the equal condition in the church, it is doctrinal. So the link between pastoral changes and doctrinal changes is close. So I would like to give you an overview of the argument I will develop in these 45 minutes. Introduction is also, if I can say, my thesis this morning, is that the main challenge is to recognize fragility as the common situation to deal with. A few years ago, in 2008, maybe you found this article of mine, I wrote an article on the fragility of marriage, on methodological questions. I reread this article before coming here. I agree with what I wrote, but not with the title, neither with the subtitles. I think I insisted much on the practices of Christian practices, the liturgy, of course, celebrating sacraments and so on. But I think what the big change is that with Amoris Laetitia, but the whole synodal process is that we don't look anymore, the church doesn't look anymore as the fragility of marriage, but looks at our common fragility. We all fragile, and I will develop that. Okay? So in this common fragility, and it will lead me to connect Amoris Laetitia and the social encyclicas of Pope Francis, Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti, because they all speak of fragility. So we cannot any longer separate the fragility of marriage from our common fragility because of climate change, because of the fragility of the planet, because of the fragility of peace. So we are in a more fragile world, and at least we are more conscious about that. And that has consequences also for looking at marriage. The synodal journey has allowed to look at changes in the light of faith for a renewed missionary discernment. That would be the first point, but this on the horizon of this shared fragility. And secondly, processes still to be developed is if we are in a synodal process, it means that what changes with Amoris Laetitia is on the move. It's still changing. It's not a change that occurred in a text. It's a process that is going on. And I will plea for certain directions of changes. And then there is room for a variety of charisms to read and to put Amoris Laetitia into practice. You know, I've been involved in the 2015 Synod. I made many formations of priests and lay people in France, at least in 10 dioceses. Now I teach in Rome. I have students from 54 countries, mainly the global south, but many from Italy as well. So I think with this larger vision, I think what changed 10 years after is that we no longer focus on chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia. Certainly the question of integration of excluded people is important, but the whole text and the way of looking at mission is important. And this opens to a variety of charisms in the church that probably were under evaluated before. I participated in Paris in last January at an event at the Bishops' Conference. We had 100 people, whole dioceses represented. It was extremely interesting because they prepared posters on what they did to implement Amoris Laetitia and the variety. One diocese doesn't do what the other does. And this understanding of the variety of resources you can have, not only in the text, but in the process of synodality is very important to recognize. So fragility is not a problem. It is primarily an opportunity. That is what Pope Francis says about families. I changed the title. I put fragility, but the quotation is families. But it is linked. And this, I would, we produced the John Paul II Institute in our review Anthropotes, a special issue on 10 years of Amoris Laetitia, but we wanted to connect it with 60 years of Gaudium et Spes. And if you reread the first sentence often quoted of Gaudium et Spes, you see the insistence on fragility. I quote, "The joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ." So even if you have a balance between joys and hopes, griefs and anxieties, you have a concentration on fragility, those who are poor or in any way afflicted. So this insistence that is more recent, but has roots in the Second Vatican Council, and has roots also in the way John the 23rd looked at the changes. You know, this way we had to look at the fragility of marriage. I repeat this title, I wouldn't choose again. We said, marriage is fragile. We are fragile. And that was the challenge John the 23rd had to face. Because in a changing world, where also the position of the Catholic Church changed, the reflex could be to protect. And his way of doing it was to call for faith in the divine providence. And the changes were that of culture, technology, but also the church's position. So you have this also in the encyclical by Pope Leo doesn't look at the changes in a negative way, but this is so the change about marriage I would put in the same line as the changes in the way of looking at the relationship between church and the world. So it's not a catastrophe. Things are changing. Things are changing, but we need faith in the divine providence. Synodality. Synodality was also because, you know, when Pope Francis called this second synod on the family after that of 1980, some said, what is he doing? But after 35 years, things had changed a lot, also because of technology. We know that many people get along with one another. They fall in love also through technology, which was not the case before. So the path, direction by Pope Francis was to consult. So 2 consultations, one before 2014, one after 2014 assembly, and discernment among the bishops. And frankly, another way, you know, there is a word in Pope Leo. I read a little bit in the airplane yesterday, but to disarm power linked to intelligence, artificial intelligence. But that was really, when I gave interviews during the Synod on Synodality, that's what I said. The synodal process managed to disarm bishops. I can tell you, in 2015, the synod was a war, ideological war, and war, power, cardinals and great voices. The synod on synodality changed a lot. And even with I have the occasion to meet some cardinals in Rome. They have discovered a way of dealing with one another that is different because they listen to one another and they speak. They listen and they take time to evaluate, to discover, to admire also the effect of what they have listened to in their own life. And this is the process, the anthropological process of synodality. So discernment according to faith and hope, because when you listen to other people, you try to listen to the voice of the Holy Spirit. That was the word by Pope Francis in October 2015. But fragility has to do also with empowerment. We cannot stay at the observation of fragility without try to empower people in the face of fragility. And we have also to reread, to re-examine the living tradition with the people of God to address new situations. It is, I take the occasion to, because I discover as the whole church, Pope Leo, what he says about the social doctrine of the church is very interesting. In the encyclica, you have, obviously it was not written by a single hand, but so you have like chapter 2, a list of principles, but you also have this approach that was already that of Cardinal Prevost when he wrote a preface for a book in Spanish, and that is now translated in Italian, on the social doctrine of the church. And he says, and you can find the same in Magnifica Humanitas, the social doctrine of the church is this heritage you receive that allow you to give new answers to new problems. New answers to new problems. That is very important. And that's the way, that's the process of theology. And especially that's why we need historical scholars in faculties of theology, because we need this process of rereading the tradition with new questions. So what I would like to do is to reread Amoris Laetitia in this historical context, that of the Second Vatican Council, to grasp a more dynamic vision of fragility. So fragility is not only chapter 8. If the word fragility is in the title of chapter 8, accompanying, discerning, and integrating is not fragility in English. It's weaknesses. Weakness. It's not the same, because weakness has a moral tonality. Sin, okay, fragility as well. So you have a very good and interesting point on Pope Leo is that he retakes like a word that is typical of Pope Francis, limitations, especially in Amoris Laetitia. But he creates a whole constellation. Very interesting. So what I believe is now Pope Leo is consolidating the teaching of Pope Francis by being more precise on concepts. A concept develops in a context, in a constellation of words. Okay. So if, some of you read French, when I speak of fragility, but the same in Italian, I would think of this beautiful book by a French philosopher, Jean-Louis Chrétien, Fragilité, 2017. Fragilité is the most beautiful book I've ever read on fragility. So, okay, this will be the challenge for the October meeting with Pope Leo, the presence of the Bishops' Conference. I hope the other day I met the bishop, a bishop of Pakistan, because we have a lay student, a female lay student from Pakistan, who took care of women from Christian minorities. So I received him 1 hour. Is the good thing being in Rome, meeting so many people. And I said, he's the president of the Bishops' Conference. I said, what are your problems? And what are not only problems, because the risk is always to look at fragility without looking at the resilience capacity of communities. And he said, no, the problems for us is the rights of women, sexual education of women. Is a Muslim country. Yeah? So I hope, this October meeting of the bishops, the president of Bishops' Conference is exactly the format that Pope Francis chose in 2014. One voice, one country, one voice. So Pope Leo said it's not a synodal process. We will work in a synodal way, but I want to consult the presidents. So what is going to happen? I don't know. What if the synodal process continues to bear fruit? It will have to listen to the minority situations, especially churches that are in minority conditions, because it changes completely the way of looking at problems and also solutions. Fragility is best understood in the light of social encyclicals. Okay, many theologians today reflect on the common fragility. You have Linda Hogan from Dublin. She says that mutual dependence and shared vulnerability are the conditions for bringing humanity together in a divided world. So she stresses the link between fragility and social needs, especially reconciliation, peace. That's why I said it's important to link fragility in Amoris Laetitia to fragility in Laudato Si, to fragility in Fratelli Tutti, in Dilexite. Nobody can be saved alone. That was Laudato Si. But the same for Fratelli Tutti, the same for Dilexite. Nobody can be saved alone. And that is a sign of our common fragility. But I would say the same for marriage. Today, is there, I think, shared vulnerability? Is there a single family that is protected from divorce, from cohabitation, from homoaffectivity of a daughter or a son? Is there a single family? Or, of course, of disease, of all the challenges. So this way of looking at the fragility of marriage has to be enlarged so that we stop looking at the fragility in one family as being the cause. The causes are much more complex. And that is the change also that the synodal process allowed, and it oriented towards a constructive response that is that of mission. From a theological point of view, I myself, with a few colleagues in Rome at the John Paul II Institute, because we changed totally after the crisis between Pope Francis and my anti-predecessor, Livio Melina, most professors have been changed. Some of them are still young, but they are very promising. And we reflect a lot on, also from the social sciences, family studies, how fragility drives families to form alliances and to recognize themselves in difficult contexts. Quindi, therefore, mutual difference becomes a source of creativity. We had a 3-day visiting professors in Rome in March on family, wars, and reconciliation, because a high percentage of our students live in countries where there is war. Cameroon, English-speaking part, Burkina Faso, Lebanon. Okay, so we had a professor from Africa, a Nigerian, we had one from Colombia, and we had one from Beirut. And that was very interesting because looking at this very concrete problem of violence, violence from the FARC in Colombia, you see that families do have a resilience capacity, but it's not total. They cooperate with violence. So we need, and this, I think, is not, there is an impulse from Amoris Laetitia, but the work is not being done. That's the responsibility of theology in relationship with social sciences. Okay, so, but it has to do with what Pope Leo says as social doctrine, as resource that teaches us how to respond to new problems. Looking at changes in the light of faith as John the 23rd did it. Avoiding oversimplification. Okay, the complexity of marriage and family matters is such that we must avoid simplifications. It is present in Amoris Laetitia 32. And Professor Jean, Professor Jean mentioned the beginning of this chapter. That is very important. A canonist colleague of mine in Rome says, he held a very, very interesting conference saying that for the first time, the magisterium recognized the complexity that is related to reality. That's the word, reality. Reality is complex. And this complexity is also named as the fact that individuals are less supported than in the past by social structures for emotional and family life. And the support was different. We didn't speak in Europe of Ubuntu, but the social support was enormous in Europe. It has disappeared. And what my African students say, they say, okay, we had Ubuntu and now it's complicated, but it's everywhere. And it's not only the Western culture that goes to Africa, it's a global change that we have to deal with responsibly. The indicators of change are both local and global. I don't insist on that, but it's true that, you know, the problem of marriage is not only divorce. Even if divorce rises everywhere in the world, is single-parent families. 30% of children in the USA are grown in a single-parent family. In South Africa, 39%. In Brazil, I visited Brazil in March because we have a section there, 50%. Okay, so you have so many issues that are not exactly related to marriage. So that's why also the question of Pope John Paul was the first to insist on family in 1980. What I find very interesting in Pope Leo's encyclica is that in some parts he rereads John Paul II in relationship between the teaching on the family and the social teaching, which is very important. And it was not always done. Things were much separated. Okay, and these changes that we look at in the light of faith, that's the competence of theology, are an invitation to rediscover the mystery of marriage and the family. What does the grace of God produce in these contexts? Certainly, Amoris Laetitia develops a theology of grace in fragilities. It is obvious. I can discuss on this if you wish, but it's mainly observed and accepted. So probably this part is the theological impetus that I would like to share with you, is that what we get from Amoris Laetitia and the synod process is that various Christian resources are still to be mobilized. Okay, we are in a situation of fragility, but fragility doesn't prevent from being creative. So what does Amoris Laetitia do? Amoris Laetitia, first of all, insists on the necessity to proclaim the kerygma to all families. To all families. And starting from their lived experiences. The first sentence of Amoris Laetitia is very clear. The joy of love that is lived in families is also the joy of love that is also a joy for the church. But all families. And it doesn't stop to a kind of moral approach, is a missionary approach. And that is still to be done. I'm coming from France, where we experienced, I don't like this word, but secularization is a complex phenomenon. But what is true that we have many adults that ask for baptism. As you said, I've been in charge of catechumenate for a few years. was one of the most interesting ministries I had. But I can tell you that if we have so many, okay, we don't know where they come from, but what I know is that we have formed people to be able to accompany catechumens. That means for 2 years, one person, one catechumen, one Christian. And that is formation of those who accompany for 2 years. And they have many questions because a non-believer, he asks all questions that you haven't thought before. So you need a theological faith formation. And also you have so many questions about affectivity, sexual life, situations, complex situations. Okay. So, but what Pope Francis says is that the kerygma must be offered to all families. So that is the thing to be done. How does the church today offer the kerygma to people who cohabitate, to people who live in a second union, to people who are in polygamous families? How is the kerygma proclaimed? That is the question. And you have a beautiful, I'm sorry to identify a few translation problems, but is also Amoris Laetitia 291. Okay, there is love in cohabitation. There is love, obviously. And number 2091 speak in English of incomplete situations. Is wrong. The official text is Italian, is incompiuto, unfinished, with this idea that what is unfinished can still flourish. It's another way. And you have this in 2094, having a positive approach instead of cautious approach, a positive approach. What do we say? The half full glass instead of half empty. Okay, this is really the process. And I think saying that about the kerygma is really a pastoral, but also doctrinal question. Because in fact, it has to do with the criticism of a certain way of looking at people in different situations, more situations, as if they were apart from salvation. No, if they are ready for salvation. There's more to be done, but everybody is a possible subject of Christianity. Okay, and this has led to rethink the link between the sacrament of marriage and baptism. I'm totally afraid in Italy to see how they have developed the marriage preparation in relationship to priesthood, marriage and priesthood. That is totally wrong. The common root is baptism. The common root is baptism. So, and Amoris Laetitia is very clear on that, and it leads to also with the claim in the kerygma is the paradigm of Christian initiation. There is a document by the dicastery Laity, Family and Life on catechumenal pathways. But I'm sorry, this document is ni fait ni à faire, not done, not to be done. They speak of catechumenal attitudes without knowing what is a catechumenal process. It's a liturgical process, it's a faith accompaniment, and we do have many people at the occasion of marriage In France now. I have even a friend. I will meet them tonight in Bordeaux because I have to celebrate a family marriage of a little cousin. They are responsible in Bordeaux of the marriage preparation. They told me, Philippe, you don't speak enough of the opportunity of marriage preparation to offer baptism to adults, because many despair marriage, because people have had no occasion to encounter the kerygma. And being in love, being prepared to found a family are moments of disponibility, availability to encounter the God of Jesus Christ. If you don't forget that marriage is connected not only to baptism, but to the sacraments of Christian initiation. So various Christian resources. Okay, so I would recommend to reread chapter 4. It is a catechesis on virtues. We are fragile in love, but we are always learning. That is good news. That's what Francis is saying. It's interesting because this chapter 4 is not a fruit of the synod. It's fruit of Pope Francis. The synod didn't speak of that. And this is really Pope Francis. Or the patience of sexuality, a fragility that opens us to the other and to the other, and to God. 143 is one of the paragraphs I prefer. What are patience? They are awakened whenever another becomes present and part of a person's life. That's why when people get married, they have this experience of a change because somebody became present in their life. At the same time, it's the same thing for a catechumen. So there is a link. I remember when I was rector in Institut Catholique, I spoke with students, young students, and they knew I was busy about marriage, theology of marriage, and they said to me, "Oh, Father Rector, we're not interested in marriage. We are interested in patience." What? The move, it's a change for a person. One of my students from Peru is doing research, doctoral research on enamoramento, the fact of falling in love as a source of social renewal in Peru, whether you have corruption and so on. How does this force of love can be a source of renewal? They have, in 10 years, they have 8 prisons in prison. Okay, so you have all this anthropology of marriage and love as a growing power. And then fragile freedom is where God pours his grace. So I don't develop, I think you know it, it's chapter 8. You understood that my argument was to say there is chapter 8, but chapter 8 is even more understood if you see how fragility is the whole context of Amoris Laetitia. So of course, I think it's very important. Number 299 is really the quotation of the text that has been voted by the Synod in 2015. And we know that German bishops have done, Austrian bishops have done a lot to get a consensus, which was not easy. And then you have this personal and pastoral discernment concept that is from Pope Francis. Very important. And it's very important because it means that even, divorced and remarried persons and other complex, so these people, they are subject of discernment. And this, I can tell you, is a personal fight I have with many students, priests, but also some lay people. No, the text says that you need some for interno. What is the English for interno? Okay. Okay. So internal form with a priest. But discernment is the act of the person herself, also in relationship with another lay person to 3012. So the description is very of how and by whom the discernment process is done to assess the possibility of being more integrated in the church. So not only access to communion, but many forms, doing catechesis, involvement in charity. It is a personal discernment process that is accompanied by a pastor, but it's personal. So it means that people in fragile condition, they still are subject. They are subject. I finish is the last slide. Various charisms and pastoral initiative. So that's what I was telling you about what I experienced in Paris for the 10th anniversary. Many different ways of involvement in different dioceses. Some try to propose the Christian faith at any age, because through marriage preparation, they discover so many people who have never had the opportunity to meet a Christian community. They meet the Christian community through the beloved person. But also the fact that you may get married later in life. Many people, at least in Europe, but it's the same in Africa, when they get married, they already have children, unless those who don't want to have children. And the no-kid phenomenon is another question. Okay, but you may get married later in life, or you may never get married. That's a rising question, I think. Baptism is not possible any longer. The number of people who don't get married, who don't in larger cities, single people are half of the population. So the church cannot ignore that. It's real life. It's real life. Okay, and then there is a need for ongoing formation on conjugal and family love. That is the impulse of chapter 4. Love is a growing power. If love doesn't grow, it will die. Okay, but this ongoing formation, conjugal and family love, calls for a reflection on the fruit of marriage, but also on integration into the Christian community, which means also the capacity of Christian communities to recognize what couples and families are experiencing. Okay, so addressing emotional and family fragility, giving space to chapter 8, certainly, but not exclusively, because the Amoris Laetitia is a whole that should not be that should not be simplified. Okay, thank you for your attention. I'm sorry for my English. I'm more used to speaking Italian, but now we can share together.